All right, welcome back to another edition of Technique Tuesday, where today I'm going to be dissecting the kettlebell swing with the help of the one and only Jason Garcia, who is a kettlebell swinging extraordinaire, as you will see here shortly. So I chose a kettlebell swing this week because as we get closer to season for our baseball and softball athletes, our programming starts to shift further down the force velocity curve, where there's a greater emphasis being placed on kind of the strength speed side of things. Okay, and so after establishing a really good base level of max strength, we start to think about how can we produce more power. All right, and one of my favorite ways to produce more power or to express more power is by swinging kettlebells. All right, so before we jump into this and Jason starts to show us his pretty swing here, there's a couple things to consider. We have several prerequisites that our athletes all need to meet before they are able to start swinging their bell. The first one is you need to really consider the athlete's training age, right? This can't be something that we throw at our middle school or younger athletes. This is usually an exercise that is reserved for some more of our advanced athletes like Jason. Second one, you really need to make sure, like I alluded to earlier, that there is a really good foundational level of strength that is established before we jump in to start doing something more dynamically like a kettlebell swing. And then lastly, you just need to learn how to hip hinge correctly first. All right, so what we're gonna do with the help of Jason here, we're gonna go over the top 5 commonly made mistakes that we oftentimes see with kettlebell swinging. So one of the first mistakes that we usually see with novice kettlebell swingers is turning your swing into what we call a squatty swing, right? So if Jason turns to the camera here and drops down into a squat, you can see that a squat is more 50% hip flexion and 50% knee flexion, where it's kind of equal hip and knee flexion, versus stand that back up. A hip hinge, which a kettlebell swing is, right, it's a hip hinge pattern, is more 70% hip hinge or hip flexion and 30% knee flexion. Okay, so if we do this wrong, this becomes that squatty swing where Jason's gonna give us a few reps of that here right now. First mistake we talked about was that squatty swing, right, where there's too much knee bend. The second mistake that we see is the lean back, right, where at the top of the swing, we're trying to overcompensate and lean back too far. All right, so this is a mistake that we oftentimes see where we don't produce enough power with our lower body, and like I said, we have to compensate by leaning back to get that bell up. Okay, so Jason's gonna demonstrate a few bad reps there with the lean back. All right, so far we've seen the squatty swing mistake, the lean back mistake, and then the third most common mistake we see is not locking the knees out. Okay, so this is important at the top of the swing, right? We need to avoid that lean back, but we also need to really concentrate on locking my knees out, right? Some of us get too caught up in it becoming an aggressive hip extension, which it is, but we also need to be cognizant of the knee extension happening at the same time as the hip extension. So Jason's gonna give us a few examples of a bad rep with the lack of knee extension. Okay, so the number 4 mistake here is not getting enough bend into your knees. So this is something that I think is really oftentimes overlooked, is making sure that there still is adequate hip flexion, but there also needs to be some really good knee flexion with this too, right? So Jason's gonna give us a few examples here of what it would look like if we don't get enough knee bend, and it's something that becomes only hip flexion and not getting enough knee flexion as well. All right, so the last mistake, number 5 here, is not being patient and letting that bell start to fall and your hips starting to fall at the same time, and allowing that bell to sweep the floor and really get too low. Ultimately, we want to keep that bell in what we call our triangle here. So when Jason is lowering the bell and decelerating it, we want to think about using our big, strong glutes and hamstrings to decelerate that weight and not our low back. Okay, so if that bell starts getting too low to the floor and we're not patient waiting for that bell to get to our hips before we break out our hips, now all of a sudden he's going to be decelerating the weight with his low back. Okay, so Jason will give us a few reps here. All right, so those were our top 5 commonly made mistakes when you are kettlebell swinging. What Jason's going to do now is give us a good set of 5 reps where he's going to fix all of those problems that he just showed us. All right, so to wrap this thing up, let's remember that the kettlebell swing is an exercise that we are prescribing to our athletes in order to help produce power. And remember, power is produced when you multiply force times velocity. So it never makes sense to overload the kettlebell swing and do a slow swing where the weight is really slowing us down. Therefore, when we do that, we lose the velocity behind the power that we're trying to produce. Going back to that number 4 commonly made mistake with the kettlebell swing was the one where we were talking about not getting enough bend in your knees. Try to think about considering that with a vertical jump, where in my opinion, the vertical jump is the best way to express power and triple extension. If we do not get enough hip bend and knee bend getting ready to load up a jump, we are not going to be able to produce enough power to put back into the ground in order to elevate us into that vertical jump. The kettlebell swing is the same way. If we do not get enough hip flexion and knee flexion, that's not going to give us enough room to get extension into that pattern. Therefore, we're not going to get the velocity behind the kettlebell.